record for those of us who are not here. Observational studies, just as it seems. They're strictly observing, no contact is made, so they don't interfere or try to change anything, they are just observing. So in some instances, it's truly the case that they are looking at subjects or watching subjects, but more often than not, observational studies have to do with looking at data that's already been compiled. So just be aware of that. Because here's the issue, there's where are my psych students? Did you guys learn about the Hawthorne effect? Does that sound familiar? Possibly.
Is that like the baby wipe thing?
I don't know about the baby wipe thing. I don't know. The Hawthorne effect is called that because there were some workers in a warehouse that was referred to as the Hawthorne warehouse. And there was this study that was being conducted, but they started acting differently because they knew they were being watched. So it affected the results. So that's what's referred to as the Hawthorne effect. Just kind of an aside note there about observational studies. So if a true observational study is happening and they are truly observing people, the people who are being observed cannot know that they are being observed, or they could act differently, right? All right. There's what's referred to, it says, because researchers in the text example first identified subjects who studied music and then collected data on their past grades, this was a retrospective study. Had the researchers identified subjects in advance and collected data as events unfolded, the study would have been a prospective study. So there's a subtle difference between the two of those. I just want you to be familiar with that terminology, okay? It's not possible for observational studies, whether prospective or retrospective, to demonstrate cause and effect relationships. So as I was saying, the only true thing that we can use to talk about cause and effect, so X causes Y, is an experiment, and it's got to be done correctly, or even then you can't say X causes Y, okay? So an experiment is a study design that allows us to prove a cause and effect. That's what we're going for if we're doing an experiment, okay? There's got to be some type of explanatory variable or some factor that you're wondering about, right? What's our objective? What are we trying to figure out? The idea of an experiment is that they are imposing some type of a treatment or manipulating things in some way to try to see if that adjusts responses, okay? So some clear-cut things that you need to know about if you're looking at an experiment. So notice what it says there. Number one, manipulates factor levels to create treatments. We're going to talk about the different treatments here in just a second. You have to randomly assign subjects to those treatments. That's an important part of it also. And then we have to be able to make comparisons there at the end. So those are three things that are very important. Okay? All right. In an experiment, the experimenter actively and deliberately manipulates the factors to control the details of the possible treatments. Then observes the response variable and compares responses for different groups or subjects who have been treated differently. By the way, those of you who are going to a school that has a med school, there's all kinds of studies that are usually going on. So it's a great way to
Get a little money from those too.
possibly get some money, possibly earn just meals, that type of thing. I'll have to tell you about a study that a friend of mine participated in here in just a minute. When we're dealing with experiments, think about kind of some other vocabulary terminology. We're going to be talking about the subjects or the participants, right? There are kind of three different principles for experimental design. Yes, you need to write this down. Number one is control. Number two is randomize. Let's talk about those first, and then we'll get to the third one. Hold that thought, though. I'm going to let you. Okay, where are my psych students? What's this control group business about?
Strict settings in the environment.
Or is vibrating.
What is a control group, guys?
Baseline.
Okay, baseline. Can you be more specific?
Group that nothing happens to.
I'm sorry?
The group that's not impacted by it.
Like, it doesn't have like an X, it wouldn't have an X variable to it, like, it wouldn't have like an explanatory variable, it would just be like what you're comparing your explanatory to.
Okay, so we use that group. The control group is also called the group that we're using for our comparison, or like she said, the baseline. Here's the deal, though. You have to realize that if you're imposing some type of a treatment, that group has to think that they're getting the treatment also, because there's definitely something called the placebo effect, and we'll talk about that on down the road, but hopefully you guys learned about the placebo effect, because that is a very real thing. So more often than not, the control group will receive a placebo, in other words, a dummy treatment, so that they think they're receiving the treatment, but they're really not. And that way they can, the people who are doing the study can make comparisons between those who are not receiving this treatment and those who are, because they're receiving it like in a pill or whatever, okay? So as much as possible, you need to have a control group, okay? So that's part of the control. The other part of it is they like to control as many factors as possible about a particular study. So think about the situation where I just said, my friend is participated in this study. She had to agree that she was not going to eat any other food other than what was provided. And for her, that was fine because she didn't want to have to go pay and spend more money on other food. But for others, that could have become an issue if they were sneaking other food and eating other food other than what they were specifically providing. So they, in an experimental environment, they want to make sure that they are controlling as many factors as possible so that there are not as many variables out there confounding, any other lurking variables out there confounding and affecting the overall results. Okay? Randomization, that's number 2. So if you notice, it says it allows us to equalize the effects of unknown or uncontrollable sources of variation. So if we randomly are putting people into different groups, whether it's the control group or the treatment group, then there's actually a better chance of getting more appropriate results. Okay? All right, the third one is that you need to be able to replicate the particular experiment also. And what that's telling us, first of all, what that's saying, the first part of that, if you notice, it says replicate by applying each treatment to several subjects. Obviously, you have to have enough subjects in each treatment group. But the other part of replication is the fact that if they're performing this study here at the University of Florida, they need to be able to replicate a similar study, and they should be getting similar results at wherever. How about UCLA or over in Germany at a university over there? So anywhere that anybody else were to replicate this experiment, they should be getting similar results. And a lot of times they do that type of thing. If they're studying something, they're checking to see, and they're trying, and they're performing these studies in different areas around the United States and internationally, and then they're going back and kind of compiling all of that data. We're not going to talk margin of error and all that, so we'll get back to that. All right, general kind of design that is used to kind of talk about or express or show how experiments are going to be set up is this visual right here. So you may want to kind of make a mental note about that, or maybe draw that on your paper. So obviously we're going to randomly assign. There's going to be at least 2 groups because it says treatment 1 and treatment 2, but really treatment 1 is probably whatever, if they're testing a new drug to see if it performs better than the current drug or something like that, then this is the group that is getting the new drug. And then this is what would be considered the control group or the placebo group. So they're still receiving, in some instances it's important that you can't if people are taking a medicine that is critical for their health, and they can't just go off of that, right? So in some instances, the control group might still be testing. So in this particular example, what I'm kind of implying is the control group would be taking this medicine that's been on the market now for the last 3 years. And they've seen fairly good results, but some new drug is out there, God bless you, and they're hoping that it's going to do better. And so the control group is going to take the quote unquote old drug, the drug that's been around, and then in the study, they're going to have the other treatment group be taking the new drug to see if there's an effect or an overall change. Obviously, at the end, the biggest part of all of this is that we've got to be able to make comparisons, right? Okay, comments, questions about any of that? Okay. Onward. Okay, so we make comparisons between this former drug that's been around for a few years and then this new drug that they tried, right? Keep in mind, there's something that's called the placebo effect. And that is, if you're taking a placebo, if you're taking just a dummy pill that doesn't even have any medicine of any kind in it, just thinking that you are taking medicine can help and improve your outlook and can affect overall results. So they have to take into account the placebo effect, right? So when they're making comparisons between two treatments, it has to be what's referred to as statistically significant, okay? In other words, differences that are larger than we would get just from the randomization alone. In other words, this control group that's taking this medicine, we're gonna get results from that are fairly positive. The numbers better be a lot higher for that other group. Okay. So the key for statistically significant, notice what it's saying down here. The important point is that a difference is statistically significant if we don't believe it's likely to have occurred strictly by chance. So if it's something that could happen by chance, then that's not statistically significant, and that drug needs to go back to the drawing board, basically, is what that would be implying. Okay, I'll go quickly. We know we're going to randomize. Okay, so control treatments. A baseline measurement is called a control treatment, and the experimental units to whom it is applied is called the control group or the placebo group. So we've already kind of talked about that a little bit. Let's think about some examples. If we're trying to determine if caffeine is going to affect overall grade performance, right, and how people perform on a particular test, then I could randomly assign each of you all to treatment groups, and some of you could get decaffeinated coffee, some of you could get caffeinated coffee, except for Katie. She's kind of in her own little world over there. God bless her. Right? Probably. But for the rest of you, sorry, I had to point that out. But for the rest of you, some of you would be in the randomly assigned to the caffeine group. So you'd get caffeinated coffee. Some of you would get decaf coffee, and then we would compare results, right? Blinding. Blinding is kind of what it sounds like, but not exactly. For those of you who've been in psych, you should understand this idea. Notice what it's saying up here. If you're going to be part of a study, it's difficult not to let knowledge influence our assessment of the response. So even if you're careful, so if you're in a study, if you decide to be part of a study, you should not know what your treatment is about. You should just know that you're receiving a treatment, and so is everybody else. You're not going to know anything specifically about what your treatment is. So that's the idea of blinding, right? So there can be what's referred to as single blinding and double blinding. Single blind that's kind of more of if it's a safety thing, if there are potential issues where somebody could possibly have some type of medical emergency or something. then the people who are administering the experiment would need to know who's receiving what treatment. And so that would be what's referred to as single blind. Obviously, the subjects have to be the ones who are blinded. Ideally, experiments should be what's referred to as double blind. So if I'm the person administering whatever the treatment is to all of the people who come into the lab, if I were to know what each person is getting, I may inadvertently kind of treat somebody differently because I know, oh, well, they're getting the treatment, so they should start to feel a lot better. You feeling a lot better today? That type of thing. Whereas if I don't know, I can't really do that, right? I can't kind of adjust or skew or bias those results. So the idea of double blind is that the person who is administering the treatment does not know who's receiving which treatment, as well as those who are actually receiving the treatment. Okay? A controlled treatment, so this is the idea of a placebo, a controlled treatment that mimics the treatment itself. So it's a fake treatment. That's the best way to actually kind of help with the blinding of each part. Is if I'm just given all of these vials and I know I have to give them here, you get this, you get this, you get this, then there's no way for me as the administrator to know. There's somebody else back behind the scenes who's keeping track of which treatment is going to each person, that thing. Okay? The placebo effect can be, like, in terms of results, you can get results as high as like 30 to 33% of an increase even in the placebo group, just because people are thinking they're receiving a treatment and so they're gonna feel better. That's what it's, okay? So 4 things to think about when we're talking about experiments. It should be randomized, there should be able to be comparisons, it should be double blind as much as possible, and it should be placebo-controlled. Okay? All right. Just as with the sampling, there are other types of experiments. So the first one is blocking that you need to be familiar with. Blocking is putting people into particular groups. So blocking is like the stratified sampling. So blocking is to experiments as stratified sampling is to sampling, okay? So notice it says blocking isolates the variability due to the differences between the blocks. So it could be male, female, it could be smokers, non-smokers, it could be other pre-existing conditions, right? So you're grouping people within similar characteristics. So this is kind of just a visual of what like a blocking could look like. So notice we've got plants from different stores, and there's kind of some different treatments that they are imposing on the plants just in terms of trying to determine. Obviously, they're going to randomly assign. They're getting plants from different stores, if you notice, and then they're breaking them up into the different treatments. So there's a control group, there's a half dose, and then there's a full dose. And then you make some comparisons at the end. Okay, this was about tomato plants, so how much salsa can you make, basically? So yeah, notice, think about what you saw in that last slide. That was 3 different treatment groups. So there was a placebo group, there was a half dose, and then there was a full dose. So you got to kind of think about different treatment groups. This is kind of another example of a block design. If you're breaking it up by like years or whatever, then within that each kind of group of the age difference, you're going to randomly assign some to a control and some to the treatment. So that's another kind of visual way of thinking about a block design. Okay. The other type of experiment that you need to be familiar with is what's referred to as matched pairs design. And there are actually 2 ways that this can be done. So one way that matched pairs design is done is that within the group of subjects, they look at particular characteristics and they basically kind of pair people up based on those characteristics. So they would say, okay, Chris is a 17 or 18-year-old male. Alec is a 17 or 18-year-old male, so we're going to basically pair them up. So then I randomly assign Chris to one group. That means Alec goes to the other group. Okay? So that's one type of matched pairs design, where they're looking at similar characteristics within the group, and then they randomly assign one and the other goes to the other group. So that's one type of matched pairs design. The other type of matched pairs design is, if you notice down here at the bottom, it's the best example is taste testing, but another example is like if you want to see, sports related, if you want to see if oxygen intake is going to help with performance, then you want them, running some sprints. You do a 100-meter and a 200-meter. You wait a period of time. You need to account for recovery time. And then you have them breathe some oxygen, do an oxygen treatment or something, and then run the 100-meter and the 200-meter and see if there's a difference in terms of their times. You've got to consider recovery time if you're doing matched pairs like that. But ideally, the matched pairs is going to be better if you are using or comparing the same person, as opposed to, there might still be some differences between Chris and Alec that we hadn't really thought of that could affect overall results. So keep that in mind. So blocking, matched pairs design are the two other types of kind of experiments that we're going to talk about. We've already talked about confounding, the fact that there are lurking variables out there that kind of are going to affect overall results, that we may or may not be able to say that whatever X is truly causing Y, because there could be other factors. Those are just examples there. We're not going to worry about that. There's the lurking variables. We've talked about that before. The other thing to be aware of is that if there are experiments going on, there is such thing as an institutional review board. So monitoring over the progress of studies that are going on. Guys, a lot of studies go on for years. And the different phases that they have of these studies, where they're testing a small group of maybe like 60, and then they have to expand, and if they get approval after the institutional review board looks at it, then they can move on and they can do a bigger study of like 300 subjects and so on. So it's a pretty involved process, and along the way, an institutional review board is kind of monitoring and checking the ethics and making sure everybody's staying healthy, that type of things. There are some times when they notice, they're like, we're not seeing any changes throughout this particular part of the site of this experiment, so you're not continuing. Or while the results are too much and it's affecting people in a bad way, so they may stop it too. Okay. I'm not worried about that. We talked about that already. This is all review, so I'm not even going to talk through that and some examples. Okay,